Fox News Podcast presents Bret Baier's All-Star Panel.
America's got to be in the lead if you want to deal with these threats. We're going to lead.
The mourning is over. The Shiva is done. And if you're a conservative, you should be optimistic.
You know, my main priority right now is making sure that it delivers for the American people.
We have to make our country great again, and I will do that.
I think the president gets criticized by people all the time for the stuff he says, by people who ignore what he does.
Now, Fox's chief political anchor, Bret Baier.
On Monday, former President Donald Trump joined Tesla founder, owner of the social media platform X, Elon Musk, for a live-streamed conversation where, over roughly 2 hours, the former president shared many of his thoughts on the assassination attempt against him, policy, and his new presidential opponent, Vice President Kamala Harris.
She is considered more liberal by far than Bernie Sanders. She's a radical left lunatic. The inflation has killed him. Food prices are up 50, 60, even 100% in some cases. And this stupid administration allowed this to happen.
The conversation ended up receiving 73 million views, according to the platform, despite being delayed more than 40 minutes due to technical issues that Musk claimed were caused by a cyber attack. Cyber threats don't stop there. The FBI confirming Monday that they're currently investigating allegations that Iranian hackers breached former President Trump's campaign after Politico received anonymous emails over the weekend with documents from inside the operation. The Harris campaign also reported that they too were a target of an unsuccessful spear phishing attack, a threat many cyber experts say will likely remain prevalent this election year. Meanwhile, overseas, Israel continues bracing for an attack after Iran vowed to seek revenge after the death of a top Hamas leader, and major developments arise in the Russia-Ukraine war as Ukraine invades Russia, marking the biggest foreign incursion into that country since World War II. To discuss this and more, we bring in our panel, Republican Strategist Colin Reed, Fox News audio political anchor, Washington Correspondent Jared Halpern, and former Biden campaign surrogate Kevin Walling. Kevin, let me start with you. You know, we're getting closing in on the Chicago Democratic Convention, and there still is this want for either Vice President Harris or her running mate, the governor from Minnesota, Walz, to do interviews or to do a press conference. And it seems to be a growing thing, not just in the media, but for people on the streets.
Yeah, Brett, I think you're right, and that those calls have only grown in terms of volume. The vice president indicated that she was going to sit down for a long-form interview by the end of the month. Of course, as you point out rightly, we're headed into convention week next week. The campaign is previewing a speech she's going to give in Raleigh, North Carolina on Friday, laying out some specifics in terms of her economic agenda for the next 4 years, and have already teased some elements of that when it comes to affordable housing, prescription drugs, tackling inflation. But certainly there are a number of calls, even from Democratic corners, for the vice president and for Governor Walz to sit down for more long-form interviews, take more questions from the press, and push back on some of that narrative that she's shying away from the media.
Yeah, Jared, I had Congressman Goldman on the other day, a surrogate for the Harris campaign, congressman from New York, who one of his answers about that question, about getting press conferences, interviews, debates, was that she needs time to figure out who she is and how she's going to run.
Well, listen, this campaign had to come together really quickly, right? And so usually you have months and months to kind of figure out where your policy positions are. Obviously, running as the vice president, the White House time and again says she has been an equal partner in the governing. So that kind of sets the record, I think, for her. But listen, as a reporter, I would love it if Harris sat down with my colleagues, with us, and did an interview. That being said, I don't know how much that narrative weighs on average voters, right? It's not, and you talk to the Harris campaign, and they say that they are out trying to get their message directly to voters. They are having these events on Zoom. They are having her out at other events around the country, and that they can reach voters without that traditional way. And to a certain extent, you've seen that from former President Trump, too. that you mentioned the interview he did with Elon Musk on Twitter. That's certainly not a conventional way to reach the media in the way that you and I sort of have covered it over the last few election cycles.
No, that's true. But he did spend 2 hours, and some part of that was on policy. And Colin, we just don't really have policy of the Harris-Walz campaign. We have one policy issue, and that was the no tax on tips, which former President Trump unveiled in Nevada in June. So there are parts of the Biden-Harris agenda that it seems like she's going to change or do something different, but they haven't laid that out yet, even on the website.
Well, a couple of things, Brett. We're 83 days away from an election, and we're at day 23 of Vice President Harris as the nominee after Joe Biden was frog marched out of the Oval Office by his own party, and there's not an interview in sight. And to the point my friend Kevin made, the end of August is 3 weeks away. That's a long time to go without an interview. And doing an interview is not something that is this Herculean effort. It's something that's expected of major candidates, especially those seeking the highest office in the land. But there are a number of policies where she has radically changed her position from 5 years ago. And she was not this unformed figure 5 years ago when she ran for president. She was a sitting United States senator in her mid-50s who had previously served as the attorney general of the largest state in the country. So this idea that she's still finding out who she is laughable to me. But one of those policies, let's check the tape on Medicare for all. That's a proposal that would cost $44 trillion. That's a proposal she co-sponsored with Senator Bernie Sanders, who's a self-avowed socialist. That's a proposal that would end the private health insurance system in this country as we know it. And Vice President Harris was an original co-sponsor in the Senate. Now we're meant to believe that she suddenly walked away from that. Well, we don't know that because she hasn't done an interview. All of these huge sweeping policy positions, they're done through statements, they're done through spokespeople, they're done through anonymous suggestions in the media. We have no idea. What we do know is the policies she supports now are different than the policies she supported 5 years ago. So either she was wrong then or she's lying now, and we need to know which one it is.
Yeah, Kevin, that is accurate. I mean, if we get these shifts of where she was in 2019 as she ran for president to where she is now on these big policy issues, they do come in paper statements from the campaign. And so I guess that's, to Jared's point, is what they're riding. You know, there was a Politico piece the other day that says this enthusiasm and excitement, they're just going to ride this as long as they can without having to answer any questions because it's working, basically. So it gets you to the convention next week, right?
Yeah, Brett, I think, everyone's guessing as to when this honeymoon ends for the vice president, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. I mean, we're seeing really good polling in terms of the numbers being flipped from where they were when President Biden was running against the former president. She's up in the battleground states of, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in that latest New York Times poll by 4 points each, and numbers are looking better in Arizona and Nevada. So there is some calculation to be had from a campaign perspective. And to Jared's point, they see the vice president out there taking the message directly to the voters, talking about key issues like prescription drugs, affordable housing, tackling inflation, other things like that, more things that she'll expand upon. Certainly when she joins the president on Thursday outside Washington, D.C., and then, of course, in North Carolina on Friday. But certainly there's going to be a lot more, fleshed out when we head into Chicago, when that kicks off on Monday.
Panel, we'll hold it right there. Right now, Jared, the Harris campaign is not agreeing to any debates before September 10th, which was the ABC debate that was agreed to with President Biden between the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign came back and said they wanted to do a Fox debate on September 4th. The Harris campaign has not answered that, said the first debate is going to be September 10th. And they'll consider, they say, debates after that if he shows up. That's their line. And so that's where we are. This is a strange thing because we're outside of the Presidential Debate Commission, which usually handles all those negotiations.
Right.
And it's basically the Wild West of debate setup.
I was about to say, wouldn't it be nice if there were a commission that could help organize all of this? Right? But, they seem to be, and it was both parties that seemed to really reject that commission. But, I mean, you think about how important this debate is going to be. If that first one is September 10th, I know you're ready to go on September 4th if the Harris campaign agrees. But how important was that first debate, and how you look back now to have that first debate in June, which at the time we thought was wildly early? Who was going to be paying attention? Why would you want to debate so early? Boy, if they had had that first debate September 10th and it went the way that it did for President Biden, Bret, we have a very different campaign. There's not a whole lot of mechanisms that would have been available to Democrats that were available after what we saw in June. And so I think for the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign, too, they have to understand the significance of these debates, and are probably going to work with a little bit of caution to make sure that they get the most out of them that they possibly can.
Which brings me back, Colin, to the interview, because she will have to do long-form interviews before September 10th in order to address what we just talked about, these different policy flips, before she gets on a stage with Donald Trump, who definitely will address them if she doesn't prior to that. I'm not a conspiracy guy, but when they moved the debate early, boy, it did conveniently let the air out of the balloon for President Biden. If he had a bad performance, there was enough time, Colin, to replace him on the ticket.
And speaking of letting the air out of the balloon, the more time passes, the more conversations like the ones we're having right now and many others are having about the lack of interviews, the more the pressure builds. And then when that first interview does come, and when she does inevitably sit down with someone, that person feels the weight of the world on their shoulders to really explore and investigate and get detailed answers on all these many questions. So the more time you delay, the greater the pain is at the other side. And that's just by the virtue of refusing to sit down with reporters. I will say this, though, in Vice President Harris's favor, her 2020 campaign was not well regarded. It didn't last very long. She didn't even make it to the votes being cast. But the highlight of it might have been on that debate stage in 2019 when she and then candidate Biden mixed it up, and she essentially accused him of supporting policies that opposed integrating schools. And it was a viral moment.
Which technically he did. I mean,
right.
Technically, as a senator, he did stand with those folks. And she made that point.
Yep, and that was a breakout moment.
Yeah, it really was. And so the question is, how is she on the debate stage now? Obviously, we saw her with Vice President Mike Pence as well. Last word, Kevin, what are you looking for the Chicago convention? We saw what happened in Milwaukee and the packaging. I think this is still a Steven Spielberg operation. They had to change their main star of it from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris, but I think the music probably sounds the same, and it's the same effort to try to get a packaging of a candidate.
Yeah, Bret. I mean, we were all out in Milwaukee, and speaking as a Democrat, that was an incredibly well-run convention from an operational standpoint. I think one of the key things I'm looking for, and they're starting to preview their speaker lineup, is to really zero in on the tenure and tone that Joe Biden sets on Monday. So he takes the stage Monday to kick off the convention in terms of evening programming and kind of do that kind of torch pass moment to really set the stage in Chicago. So that's one of the things I'll be zeroed in on.
It'll be fascinating. Jared, obviously, another thing is...
Well, I was just going to say to that point, when we walked into the convention in Milwaukee, we didn't know what the full ticket was yet, if you recall. So I think maybe you think of all the chaos that we've had in this election. I think we know what the ticket is going into Chicago. We couldn't say that going into Milwaukee yet, could we?
Right. And finally, we're going to see whether these protests develop. Yeah. And Chicago has a infamous history in 1968 of some pretty big protests.
And you wonder if the withdrawal of President Biden diminishes those protests at all. As somebody who covers the White House, has traveled an awful lot with President Biden, you have seen, especially surrounding Gaza, those protests really follow him wherever he went around the country. Since he is not going to play a prominent role in this convention, I do wonder if that's going to have an impact. Maybe it doesn't, because this is still a group and protesters that are probably going to air their grievances along with the vice president. Because, again, to your point, she has not really sat down in an interview and talked about what her policy is. Is it any different than President Biden's as it relates to Israel, as it relates to the war in Gaza?
Obviously, she had a different tone after meeting with Bibi Netanyahu than we didn't hear from President Biden after that. Gentlemen, thank you. Now for a bit of history. On August 13th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act. Building upon President Reagan's support of supply-side economics, the package of tax and budget reductions would go on to set the tone for his administration's trickle-down economic policy, as called by his critics. Although economists argue to what degree Reagan's economic policies drove the boom of the 1990s, there's no doubt his tax program unleashed powerful forces that would go on to change the world in both long and short-term economic gains. That'll do it for this week. You can hear more of this series at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts. Make sure to leave a rating and a review. We want to hear from you. For Jared, Kevin, and Colin, I'm Bret Baier. We'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.